Tonight on Nova. Most scientists take great care with their research, but what happens when they don't?
It doesn't take much to take a little bit of the data, change it the way you want it to look, and then publish it. And it's impossible to detect that.
With more and more scientists doing more and more research, it is difficult to detect and correct mistakes. Is fraud increasing as a result? Do scientists cheat?
Funding for NOVA is provided by Prime Computer, supplying integrated computer solutions to the world's manufacturing, commercial, technical, and scientific marketplaces. And the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. Major funding for NOVA is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide.
Fraud, misconduct, misrepresentation, cheating. Not exactly what first comes to mind when one thinks about science. After all, science is supposed to be the pursuit of truth, and one doesn't discover truth by faking it.
Science works on an assumption. The assumption is everybody is being truthful. That if somebody says, we did an experiment, and they tell you how they did it, what they say is accurate. It's accepted that what they say may turn out to be wrong for factors beyond their control, because of things they didn't think of, things they didn't know about at the time. But it is assumed that if they say we did an experiment, here are the data points, that those really are the data points. That's the whole foundation of science. If that foundation is breached, well, then you really have nothing left, because everything you build upon it is building on sand. It's meaningless.
The 1980s have witnessed a flurry of scientific fraud and misconduct cases, including a number of cases as yet unresolved. As a result, concern over cheating in research is at an all-time high. Though most of the cases have occurred in the biomedical field, they've thrown a shadow over all of science.
This morning, the subcommittee will focus on scientific fraud and misconduct in connection with scientific research.
Those who engage in inappropriate practices represent a significant threat both to the integrity of science and the confidence of its public and private sponsors.
A scientist who cheats injures other scientists by misleading them, and he injures the public by wasting their money and sometimes by falsely claiming discoveries that directly affect the public health and welfare.
After the initial inquiry by this committee into this subject, the committee has had growing reason to believe that we are only seeing the tip of a very unfortunate, dangerous, and important iceberg. The full extent.
But many scientists disagree.
The idea that there's massive fraud today in science is simply nonsense, in my opinion. There are a few cases of fraud. They have not been shown to have a major impact on science, and they're a tiny bit in a mass of data which is turning out enormously exciting results of great practical use to mankind.
We support over 20,000 projects each year. We support over 50,000 scientists, and that there should be a few cases per year of egregious dishonesty is regrettable, but I don't think it indicts the entire enterprise.
If you will please each raise your right hand.
In this hour, we will try and gain some perspective on the contentious and important issue of scientific fraud and misconduct.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you will please take your seats.
We'll focus not on pending cases, but on already resolved instances of fraud, where all the facts are a matter of public record. Our goals are to understand what might motivate a researcher to be less than totally honest, to examine the methods scientists rely on to catch and deter misconduct, and to consider the adequacy of the scientific community's response when a scientist cheats. Cheating in science is nothing new. Perhaps the most celebrated of all cases occurred in the early 20th century when a doctored orangutan jaw and fragments of a human skull were buried in the gravel off Piltdown Common in southern England. Sometime later, these artifacts were discovered by amateur geologist William Dawson. Dawson's Piltdown Man was quickly accepted as the missing link between man and ape. It made a particular stir in England, where it was hailed as proof that the earliest man was indeed British. Though Piltdown Man was reduced to the status of a puzzling anomaly by subsequent discoveries, it wasn't until the 1950s that new dating technologies finally proved it a hoax, a half-baked fraud that had conned almost an entire generation. What's striking about Piltdown is how readily it was accepted. People believed in it because they wanted to believe. The scientific ethos demands objectivity on the part of the experimenter and organized skepticism from the entire scientific community. Yet scientists, like the rest of us, are products of the culture and times in which they live. Sometimes cultural bias overwhelms scientific objectivity. When it does, the consequences can be grave. Sir Cyril Burt was one of the pioneers of applied psychology in England. He believed intelligence was inherited, that this was why the children of wealthy, educated families did better on intelligence tests than the children of working-class families.
I want you to draw from memory.
Beginning in the 1930s, his research, including studies of identical twins separated at birth, supported this contention. His work became the basis of a school system that reinforced class separation. In this country, as late as 1971, it was used by Shockley, Jensen, and other scientists who argued blacks are genetically incapable of attaining the intellectual level of whites. His work remained a standard of psychological research for over 30 years, until Leon Kamen burst Burt's bubble.
I have to say that I came into this area from the outside. I had done all of my work in animal learning and conditioning. And I have to say that I started with a profound skepticism about the utility of IQ testing anyway. So as an outsider with a skeptical attitude to begin with, it occurred to me to go back to the original sources and say, hey, wait a minute, this stuff just doesn't look right to me. And once I started looking at it, I swear, within about 5 minutes, it was obvious to me that Cyril Burt was a fraud and a charlatan. I don't see how anyone with an open mind or with a skeptical mind could have missed that. It turned out that when you began to look at Cyril Burt's data, it had a really remarkable property. In fact, an insane property, an obviously fraudulent property. He kept on increasing his sample size throughout his lifetime as he published later and later papers. The remarkable thing is that as his sample got larger and larger, the statistical results remained identical to the third decimal place. Now, this conceivably could happen. It's also possible that the sun might not rise tomorrow morning, and that's a lot more probable, in fact, than in the real world getting exactly the same result statistically to the third decimal as you keep on adding to your sample size. And then once you started looking at Cyril Burt's published work, it turned out that often he didn't describe his procedures at all, he didn't mention what intelligence tests he had used, and it turned out that the research assistants, whom he claimed had done all the testing, Miss Howard and Miss Conway, never existed. They were figments of his imagination. It was simply faked all the way.
Less celebrated, but almost as disturbing, was a recent case of fraud in another area of psychology, mental retardation research. In the early 1980s, Stephen Bruning built a reputation as a leading authority on the use of behavior-altering drugs in the treatment of the mentally retarded. Physician and institutional practices, even state policies, were altered to be consistent with what Bruning reported as scientific findings. He advocated a sharp reduction in the use of tranquilizers and a significant increase in stimulant use. His work might still be influencing patient treatment around the country, if not for his former mentor, Robert Sprague. Sprague also studies the effects of behavior-altering drugs. He knows from experience how hard it is to pull together big studies that yield clean, objective data on patient response. He watched with admiration as Bruning rose to prominence, yet he couldn't shake a bad feeling he had about Bruning's work.
The papers were so good, the studies so big,
the results so clear-cut, one began to wonder.
Were Bruning's studies too good to be true, or was it jealousy of a former student? Bob Sprague couldn't be sure at first. Finally, his suspicions drove him to conduct a detailed review of Bruning's published articles. From this and other information he had gathered, Sprague became convinced Bruning did not have access to as many patients as he claimed to have studied. This could only mean one thing.
He simply made up subjects, sat down at midnight and made them up. Publications claiming 20, 50 subjects, but there's no documentation that they were ever seen. When challenged on this, he had some pat answers. He usually said, "Oh, I did that previously when I was at Oakdale." When you go back to Oakdale, basically what he did there was work with goldfish, perhaps some more.
In December of 1983, Robert Sprague turned his information over to the National Institute of Mental Health, which found Bruning guilty. For almost 5 years, Bruning maintained his innocence. Then, in September of 1988, he pleaded guilty in federal court to falsifying scientific data to obtain federal grants. Without Bob Sprague's skepticism and determination, Stephen Bruning's misconduct might never have been exposed. But in a field with a direct impact on patient care, why was he the only scientist to dig a little deeper and discover the truth? These 3 cases, Piltdown, Burt, and Bruning, all involve the fabrication of data. But the issue of misconduct in science is broader and more subtle than that. Martin Shapiro is a member of the Institute of Medicine's Committee on Responsible Conduct in Research. He has studied examples both of research done sloppily to the point of negligence and of cooking and trimming, the manipulation of data to make results appear better than they actually are.
Sometimes the results of an experiment are so clear that everyone understands what those results mean. But very often, the results are far less unequivocal, and the data require some interpretation before any conclusions can be drawn. And it's in those circumstances that there is much opportunity for people to manipulate data in ways that might be inappropriate. Let me give you an example. Let's take an experiment in which 80 people have a cancer, and half of them are going to be treated with an experimental drug, and the other half are going to receive a placebo. People generally are randomized between these 2 treatments. So of 80 subjects, 40 are assigned to the experimental group. They will receive the drug. And the other 40 are assigned to the control group. What then happens is that we see in the control group that 6 months later, 20 of them are dead, shall we say, and 20 are alive. In the experimental group, 29 are alive and 11 are dead. This is a statistically significant difference.
By convention, a result is considered significant if it can happen by chance less than 5% of the time. Chi-square, a series of simple formulas, is one way scientists distinguish chance events from those due to experimental treatment. Here, 29 survivors out of 40 passes this test.
This is publishable. If it's an important tumor, if it's a new development in the management of that disease, it would undoubtedly be published in an important journal. But let's take the same experiment and have the results come out a little differently. And I mean just a little differently. Instead of 29 survivors out of 40, let's make it 28.
Solving the chi-square again reveals that 28 survivors out of 40 is a result that could occur by chance more than 5% of the time. Thus,
this result does not achieve statistical significance. And yet, in this case, 70% of subjects have survived. In this case, 50%. It looks like an important difference. To the investigator, looking at these findings, he might say, gosh, I really believe this treatment works. This is an important advance in the management of this disease. How unfortunate that we're just not quite at that level that we call statistical significance. What's he to do? Well, a very normal response is to want to go back and look at the data, make sure he didn't get it wrong, make sure there isn't something there that doesn't reveal the truth as he knows it to be. And so he goes and he looks, and he decides that one of these 12 cases of people who were treated who died was someone who perhaps didn't receive all of the medication, or perhaps didn't quite meet the criteria for entry into the study. And he decides that that person shouldn't have been in the experiment. And so he drops them from the experiment. And suddenly there are only 11 of 39 who died. This is statistically significant again. The unethical conduct would be not to report these kinds of manipulations of the data. The perfectly ethical investigator would continue to collect data. He would expand his sample size. And if the same trend remained, it would reach statistical significance at some point. But that might take another year or two to do. This person might not have time or the patience to do that.
It doesn't take much to cook the data, to take a little bit of the data, change it the way you want it to look, and then publish it. And it's impossible to detect that. That sort of fraud is impossible to detect. You cannot find the data point that was left out. You can't find the little point that was moved somewhere. You can't find the test tube that looked like it was 4 instead of 5, and the person writes down 4.
While many researchers maintain that misconduct is a small, if annoying, problem, concern within the scientific community at large is growing. This conference on scientific misconduct was sponsored by the American Association for the Advancement of Science.
And I acknowledge that if the scientific community doesn't admit that the problem is worth addressing and address it in an undefensive way, then it's got a problem. And I would not
Much of the discussion at gatherings like this focuses on the mechanisms built into science that are supposed to catch or deter misconduct. One of these is the practice of having outside experts review and assess scientific papers prior to publication. The Journal of the American Medical Association is a leading biomedical publication. Every week, JAMA receives hundreds of scientific manuscripts. Each is assigned to an editor. This pile included a new study on AIDS. It was given to senior editor Drummond Rennie. Rennie read the paper and then got in touch with 2 outside experts and asked them to referee it.
I would very much like a quick review on this.
One of the experts Rennie turned to was Jerome Cassirer of the Tufts New England Medical Center.
The responsibility of a referee is to provide an objective assessment of a scientific manuscript. To do that, it's necessary to look very carefully at the methods to see if they're appropriate, to look at the data that are reported and to see if the data could be obtained by the methods, and finally to determine whether the conclusions are appropriate. It's very hard for a referee to uncover misdeeds. The referee basically takes on trust the data that are given to him. The referee can't go back into the data books of the scientist and simply must assume that the data the scientist is giving you, the data that he or she has observed.
After receiving the comments of his referees, the editor gets back in touch with the author, explaining what has to be done before the paper can be published. Sometimes this can mean additional experiments.
Yeah, well, you just have to go back and get new data. Sorry, but if you do, I'd say you might have a pretty interesting paper.
Those letters in the New England Journal.
Once a week, the journal's editors meet to discuss manuscripts. The written opinions of the peer reviewers are read. The staff statistician comments on how well the numbers support the author's conclusions. And of course, concern is voiced as to how important and interesting the paper will be to the journal's readership.
That makes no sense. So yeah, it's the subject matter is certainly important, but I think it's the most boring thing I've heard in the last 2 weeks.
You don't like good news.
I'm glad I'm in one of those categories. That's right. Peer review process is a wonderful process for throwing out garbage, for making sure things that have been done before aren't repeated, for making sure things are written in a clear fashion. For detecting fraud, and I can't see the peer review process, except for occasional lucky chances, detecting fraud. If somebody wants to commit fraud, it can be done, and nobody's going to detect it.
The fact is, almost anything written, including sloppy and fraudulent work, can be published somewhere. Even when a paper is turned down by one journal, it's likely that one of the other 40,000 regularly published journals will print it. But for many scientists, this is not cause for alarm. That's because they believe the ultimate defense of scientific accuracy is the process of replication, the independent verification of experimental results.
what is going to happen in a very exciting field like cancer, like AIDS, and so forth, is that if you put out a false result, it's going to get caught within 6 months to a year, almost surely by somebody else doing the experiment. So what's the incentive of a very prominent scientist to deliberately put an incorrect result in the literature? It's got to be silly.
Yet only a small percentage of the science done every year gets the attention given cutting-edge work in a hot field. With 1 million scientific papers published every year, it's likely many are never even read. Most are not repeated.
If you apply to a granting agency saying, I'd like to repeat this work, you're likely to be told, why repeat this work? We want to advance knowledge. We want new knowledge. The granting agency will support not a mere repetition of what's already well known. Show us something exciting and new, and we might support it.
Even when an experiment is repeated, divergent results don't necessarily mean fraud.
The trouble with replication is if you try to repeat somebody's work and you can't, there's just too many possible explanations. The reagents are a little bit different, or circumstances are a little bit different, and you just can't come to the conclusion that that person made up his results.
Peer review and replication do catch some misconduct. And defenders of the status quo argue that enough is caught to deter most researchers who are tempted to cheat. Yet one recent study has alleged science's quality control mechanisms can't even be counted on to catch simple sloppiness, let alone a clever fraud. This controversial study was made by Ned Fader and Walter Stewart of the National Institutes of Health. Their concern was not outright fraud, but rather lesser forms of misconduct such as sloppiness, cooking, and trimming. They realized information about the research practices of other scientists would be almost impossible to obtain. So they chose to study a group of scientists whose work had already been closely scrutinized. All of the researchers who had co-authored one or more papers with John Darcy. Darcy was an admitted fraud, but his co-authors had been cleared of wrongdoing by 3 independent investigations. The records of these investigations, which included original lab documents, raw data, and testimony from co-workers, provided Fader and Stewart with a unique window through which they could study the routine work habits of 47 reputable scientists.
It was a little bit like looking into their lab notebooks, which is something you normally can't do with a scientist. And we discovered something very interesting. We discovered that these scientists also had been engaged in various practices that they shouldn't have been. Practices that I think most scientists would regard as departing from accepted standards of research. And it wasn't just a few of these 47 who were doing that, lots were.
These practices ranged from deliberate misstatements of fact, where a person would know something or should have known it at the least and say the opposite, to republishing data that they'd already published and disguising the fact, to not investigating allegations of wrongdoing, right down to much more minor things like putting your name on a paper where you hadn't been involved in the science, or publishing a paper that was just loaded with errors in such a way that it looked as if nobody had read the paper carefully. And when we saw the percentages of scientists who'd been involved in at least one of these activities, we were very surprised. It was a full 70%, of something we never would have guessed. We came across one particular case where a single error called into question the entire paper, simply by virtue of the type of error it was. There was a human pedigree showing the inheritance of a disease, and it purported to show a 17-year-old male who had the disease, who had 4 children. And the oldest of these children was 9 years old. And if you think about that, that means that at the age of 8, supposedly, this person impregnated the mother of his first child. And while that's not biologically impossible necessarily, it's so improbable that you would think the readers, the referees, the editors would have said, what's going on here?
And this was not published in some obscure journal. It was published as the lead article in the New England Journal of Medicine.
Anxious to share this information, they prepared a paper for publication, totally misjudging how disturbing their findings would be to both the subjects of the study and the scientific community. Threats of lawsuits held up publication for 3 years, but didn't stop the paper from becoming one of the most argued about manuscripts of the decade.
It was perfectly clear that there was a lot of emotion connected with the discussion of the subject of misconduct in science. It's not something that scientists consider in a dispassionate sense, the way they're supposed to consider their normal work in the laboratory. I think a lot of the scientists who objected to our work may themselves feel compelled through all sorts of pressures to engage in some of these practices themselves. And of course, it makes them very uncomfortable to discuss this subject publicly.
The one conclusion that scientifically seems hard to argue against is that the quality control system, the referees, especially the referees and the editors who are meant to look at papers for accuracy and completeness, this system just didn't work in all these cases, and that's a very disturbing thing. The other thing that's disturbing is in this particular sample, the percentage of wrongdoing was so high that it calls to mind the question, could this possibly be typical of the rest of biomedical science? And we don't have the answer to that question because you'd have to do a different sort of study. But it raises the question in a very strong and sharp form in a way that's hard to ignore.
Stewart and Fader have done essentially one experiment. And one of the things it clearly showed was that a close reading of scientific papers would disclose some errors that most scientists would be embarrassed about. On the other hand, I think it's also clear that it's not possible to extrapolate from one sample of the co-authors of John Darcy to all of biological science. It's simply an inappropriate extrapolation from one experiment, essentially one piece of data.
We have gotten very few scientists to tell us, you guys are overestimating the problem. We have very few people saying, you know, it's interesting what you're saying, but I've never seen examples of it. We get an enormous number of people who said, I've seen examples of it happening. So I don't think people are skeptical. I mean, actual working benchtop scientists are not skeptical about what we're saying. The sociologists of science, the people who want to turn this into an art form and study it, say, where are the numbers? Where's the data? How do you know that's right? And from a scientific point of view, they're right. You can't pin it down. But the sense I get, or we haven't yet, and we haven't done the study and nobody else has, but the sense I get from our colleagues is they're saying, we've known about this for a long time. We know it's a severe problem. We don't know what to do about it. We don't even know how to talk about it.
Whether or not things are as bad as Stewart and Fader believe, the 1980s have seen more reported cases of fraud than ever before. Increasingly, concern is being expressed that the competitive pressures under which most scientists work may be driving some of them to cheat. This is the Materials Research Laboratory at Penn State University. Here, scientists are learning to grow diamonds, create new superconductors, and make better cement. The lab employs 250 people and is considered one of the best of its kind in the world. Like hundreds of other labs around the country, it's a product of the dramatic increase in federal and corporate funding for research that began at the end of World War II. Today, the United States spends over $90 billion a year on research and development. This money supports 6 times more scientists than were working in 1950. In fact, 90% of all the scientists who ever lived are alive today. All this money, all these scientists, have changed the world of science in ways unanticipated 40 years ago.
Well, you know, to run a lab like this is the materials lab at Penn State, which is one of the biggest in the country. We have about $8 million a year. That means that we got to hustle for 90% of that. Every year we got to raise $8 million. It'll be $10 million next year. And that roughly we write about 200 proposals. That's 4 proposals a week going out to the lab, some of them running to millions of dollars, some maybe $25,000.
It's not a bad idea. I mean, the area is good. I think we clearly have a lead in the microwave heating of ceramics. And you guys have by far the best team on the question of the theory.
And all that activity means that most of the faculty are largely marketers. They have to spend their time on the road, they spend their time going to meetings, they spend their time appearing in Washington and writing proposals. That's a very major component of American science today.
Yeah, I thought the one thing we could add is to put in a sheet which says what we've done in the past. Yeah. Basically research accomplishments, because the typical peer reviewer doesn't know what the hell he's doing. He doesn't go and look up our bibliographies. Yes. So I think we got to be explicit.
If you want to impress people with how good your science is, if you want to get tenure in a modern university, if you want to get a research grant, you can't afford to come and say, well, I think that this might be the case, but there are all sorts of indications over here that it might not be the case, and it's all sort of confused. People always tend, in science as elsewhere, to sharpen up and clean up a story.
You frequently know that there have been discussions about what can we tell them, what shall we leave out. It's not actually that you want to leave out something in order to mislead people about the data you're presenting. It is really that you don't want to know how far you've got, because you don't want a rival jump on it.
That's not fraud.
Of course it's not a fraud. Of course it's not a fraud. It is part of a general atmosphere in which you're not actually saying to people, tell the truth, tell the whole truth, and let it all out.
That's competitiveness.
Yes,
That's what's driving this competitiveness.
We are really building a very dangerous foundation. The dangers are that people will be turned off, that the young scientists will say, we're not pursuing truth, we are trying to make a buck, we're trying to get money for research, and we will use any means. And that's where the origin of hard cheating is. If I can compromise a little bit, then why shouldn't I compromise more?
Look, you get a job in a university where you're supposed to teach and do research. In the first place, nobody cares about your teaching. Basically, you're being paid to publish and do research in most universities. You have 5 years, usually, in which to publish a lot of research. If you don't get a lot of research published at the end of those 5 years, then your PhD, all your training, you may be out there pumping gas. People understand that perfectly well. They've got to produce, and they've got to produce quickly in order to get a tenured job in a university. That's an enormous pressure to put on young people who are just starting out. If some of them turn out to succumb to that kind of pressure with less than total honesty, why should we be surprised?
The system somehow says that's not our problem. We did the best we could do. They somehow went wrong. They didn't learn enough by our models at the bench. And I think this is a much bigger problem than just one or two deranged...
Let's go back to where solving this problem starts. This problem starts in grammar school. It starts with, and outside of school. It starts with where children first begin to learn what science is about.
Scott McGee teaches science to 7th graders in Brookline, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston. He spends a lot of time teaching his students the scientific method, explaining often why the process is as important as the result.
Many of us refuse to consider that failures or the discovery that you lack a certain important piece of information is also valuable information. It is success itself.
In order to help make this point, McGee assigns his class an experiment with no one right answer. Each child takes a large jar to a nearby pond, fills it with water, mud, algae, and tiny organisms, and then observes this mini ecosystem for 3 months. In the end, a paper is written describing the organisms present, what or whom they ate, which ones prospered, and which ones died.
What's the missing piece of information that would help you? Is there any missing?
It's the kind of project that's designed to emphasize the scientific process rather than its results. But even by age 12 or 13, children have learned that results are important. That in most cases, that's what gets judged and rewarded.
There is the tendency, or there is always the danger, that you're going to take your limited bit of information that you've all admitted is extremely limited and make more of it than you really can. And in fact, to illustrate the point, yesterday I think it was, or a couple of days ago, I asked the 8th grade who had done this project last year, how many of you falsified your data in order to fit the end result? Every single hand in the class went up. Every single student in the class raised their hand and said, yes, we falsified our data in this area or that area. For example,
not satisfied to report minimal results, the children made exaggerated claims about what had taken place in their ecosystems, often trying to match the number and nature of the organisms present to population models they learned about in their textbooks. One of those students came back to talk about why.
I felt really bad about lying, but I just felt so pressured to have all the answers. And so, I didn't know that everyone else had lied until, after we turned it in, because everyone's like, oh, I lied, don't tell him, because we didn't want to get bad grades and all this stuff, because I think we were more pressured to get, good grades than to think about the science part of it.
If they kind of falsified information, I guess I would think that it's kind of okay, but I wouldn't do it. After this discussion, I wouldn't do it.
Marco?
I think that, falsifying information is so easy. For example, if
should any of these children continue in science, they will no doubt be told again and again about the importance of honesty in research. Yet it's equally true they will continue to feel pressure to be productive, to get right answers. Some scientists fear those pressures are increasingly likely to overwhelm basic scientific values.
When your teacher gives you an assignment.
Tenure and promotion committees of universities count the numbers of publications that someone grinds out. There's an enormous premium on publishing a lot. People are trying to get their names attached to as many publications as they possibly can. So that very commonly now you find huge teams where 16 people all sign their name to a particular publication, which probably wasn't worth publishing in the first place. But this is part of a kind of rat race, a competitiveness, a vulgar quantitative counting mentality that's absolutely encouraged by the structure of science in the United States today.
The misconduct of Robert Slutsky, a heart researcher at the University of California in San Diego, can easily be seen as a natural consequence of this system. Robert Slutsky was studying heart disease using animal models. By everyone's account, he was a hard worker. In 7 years, he wrote 160 papers. During one 2-year stretch, his name appeared on a new paper every 10 days.
Well, what do you do when you have someone who's very productive? Usually you're delighted, and that was certainly the case with Slutsky. The department was delighted, the chairman was delighted. Here was someone who had a lot of ideas, and the fact that he wrote zillions of papers just made his CV look good, made him a good person to have representing the department at meetings of your specialty. You know, look, San Diego's got this great research program going.
Though there had been some complaints about sloppiness in some of his work, Slutsky was clearly on the fast track, headed for a professorship and his own lab. And then, in a chance reading of 2 of his papers, a faculty member noticed that identical results were reported for 2 different experiments. A very unlikely coincidence.
The faculty member thought this is probably a mistake. It's the sort of thing that could happen by mistake in typing up a manuscript. And so the message got to Dr. Slutsky, you'd better explain to us about this funny discrepancy. We're sure it's something you can explain. And instead of getting what they had sincerely hoped would be a good, clean explanation, Slutsky ended up saying, I can't find the data for these experiments. I can't help you with it, and couldn't say any more. And a couple of days later, he resigned.
Slutsky's sudden resignation prompted an investigation. No one was prepared for what it found. In the end, it was determined that 12 of Slutsky's published papers were demonstrably fraudulent, and another 48 were questionable. A total of 60 unsubstantiated articles had made it through the peer review process and had been published in biomedical journals around the world.
The kind of cheating that Slutsky did covered a very wide spectrum. It starts off simple. It's the sort of thing that anybody might do. You might say, oh, I've got a standard deviation on these data, which is higher than I really like. Why don't I just make that number a little bit smaller? I believe the data. I'm sure the results are true. The averages look okay. It'll look better if my standard deviations aren't so high. That must be a temptation to a lot of people, because that's, unless you publish the raw data, that's something that can't be checked. And then there were some other things along the lines of cleaning up your data, cleaning up your experiment. When you send a paper in to a journal, it comes back very often with a comment, why didn't you do such and such as part of the process? Slutsky then went ahead and did such and such, but only on paper.
What we found were clear instances where he reported lots of experiments that had never been performed. For example, using one of the techniques known as computerized tomography, the papers that he published reported over 250 of these particular scans that would have been performed. And from a very accurate log that's kept at the CT scanner, we knew that no more than a couple of dozen were performed. So clearly all of the others had been fabricated. You can see they got...
The inescapable question is, how did Slutsky get away with it? Shouldn't someone have noticed something and spoken up?
It never occurred to me that a scientist would fabricate data. I knew that there had been maybe 1 or 2 rare instances in the past, but that it would happen with someone I knew just didn't seem possible to me. So I thought that here was someone who was sloppy, careless. I didn't want to work with him, but I never dreamed that he was fabricating data, so I never bothered to look more closely.
There were people that were with him who did observe misconduct and chose not to report it. Because when you report misconduct of someone that is your superior or that is viewed with a lot of respect by other people around the institution, you put yourself at great risk.
If you criticize somebody, he may lash back out at you. He may sue you for saying something bad about him. He may say, you've said something about me that might threaten my getting a research grant. You've ruined my career by questioning what I do. That's unacceptable to me. So a lot of faculty might think, I don't want to make waves. I don't want to get involved in this. That certainly happened with one of the faculty members in our institution. He had very strong suspicions that what Slutsky was doing was improper. He didn't want to get involved. He took the defensive posture of pulling his own people away from Slutsky and avoiding him as much as possible.
In its report on the Slutsky case, UC San Diego acknowledged its role in fostering the opportunity for this sort of misconduct. Unfortunately, few universities, when confronted with the task of investigating misconduct, have conducted as thorough or candid a self-appraisal, a point that was noted at the recent congressional hearings.
We have been shocked to find that the National Institutes of Health relies completely upon the universities to investigate themselves. Apparently here we have the possibility of the fox actively investigating the chicken coop. In this system, the university gets the first crack at the data, or lack thereof, and at the witnesses. It also gets to frame the issues. There is, of course, a natural tendency for any institution or bureaucracy to limit the damage.
In fact, there's evidence in some of these cases of an actual cover-up. So we have cases that show the system doesn't work. You come before us and say it does work, and yet, Dr. Wyndham, you can't give...
Perhaps the most serious question raised at this hearing was whether the scientific community really wants to expose misconduct. The stories of scientific whistleblowers reinforce this concern. Jerome Jacobstein is director of nuclear medicine at Graduate Hospital in Philadelphia. He came here from Cornell University Medical School, where in 1981 he uncovered what he believes is a clear case of scientific misconduct.
In October 1981, a medical student, came into my office with a draft paper of some research work that we had done as a collaborative effort with several people. And over the next day or two, when I had a chance to read this paper, I was appalled to find that there were a substantial number of misrepresentations of the facts in there.
For example, the paper claimed that all the experimental subjects were free of drugs. In fact, at least 14 and possibly 43 of the participants were taking medication. The paper also made claims about blind observations and the sequencing of tests, which Jacobstein knew were incorrect.
I spoke to the medical student after having read the article and was told that he was asked to put those in, that his original draft had not included those errors and misstatements, but that he had been asked to put them in by one of the senior investigators.
Jacobstein felt strongly that this represented a conscious attempt to make a sloppy experiment look good. He wrote the senior investigator, and when he received no response, he took the matter to the dean of the medical school, who agreed to have a committee look into it.
When I spoke to the dean several days later to get the findings, he told me that everything was okay, that no misconduct had been demonstrated. When I asked him how that could be in view of the evidence that I had presented, he said he couldn't tell me, that I should just take his word for it, that they were very careful and very thorough and everything was fine.
Which is where things might have died, but Jacobstein was unwilling to accept what he saw as a whitewash. Instead, he took his information first to the university administration and then to the National Institutes of Health. For 6 years, Jacobstein doggedly pushed the scientific establishment to take this case seriously. Finally, in 1987, the NIH issued a report confirming Jacobstein's basic charges. They declined to call the misstatements deliberate, but did reprimand both the senior investigator and the university.
What I found perhaps most surprising was the degree of moral apathy that is present in the medical scientific research establishment. The sense of outrage seems to be absent. even people who would not even consider, under any circumstances, indulging in this kind of behavior or tolerating it among their colleagues, nonetheless don't seem to find it as intolerable, as outrageous, as inexcusable when it does come up, as I should think that they would find it.
If blowing the whistle is difficult for a senior person like Jacobstein, it is virtually impossible for a junior scientist. Chemist Bruce Hollis blew the whistle while still a postdoc, and it very nearly cost him his career. Hollis was doing vitamin D research at a Veterans Administration hospital affiliated with Case Western Reserve Medical School when he became convinced his lab chief, Phil Lambert, was faking experiments. Hollis reported his suspicions to Lambert's superiors. When it appeared nothing would be done, he quit Lambert's lab. Months later, he discovered his name had been placed on a paper Lambert had prepared for publication. At a national meeting, Hollis let it be known he had nothing to do with the research and in fact doubted its validity.
And immediately after the statements were made, Dr. Lambert said that these are horrendous allegations and unfounded, and basically I want to be investigated. And his superiors at the VA said, that's right, he needs to be investigated to clear these allegations that are clouding his brilliant scientific career. And at that point it was pointed out to me that I was in dire straits, that I would pay for tarnishing the reputation of what they would refer to as a rising star in their institution. And it went on from there.
The investigations that followed at both the VA and Case Western took, from Hollis's point of view, a bizarre and shocking turn.
I was accused of all kinds of things: sabotaging the laboratory, stealing things from the laboratory, misleading technicians, everything imaginable. I was my position was terminated, given a year's notice, and I was killed in the newspapers along with the other people who were implicated. But the point that you can't lose sight of is that I had gone from whistleblower and an alligator to a co-conspirator in the very research that I had questioned, and I viewed my scientific career as being ended.
Fortunately for Bruce Hollis, the banner headlines caught the NIH's attention. They decided to conduct their own investigation, which confirmed his basic charges against Lambert and absolved him of any and all wrongdoing. Hollis is now continuing his research at the Medical University of South Carolina, a bit battered and bruised emotionally, and a lot more cynical about the world of science.
I would never go through this again, having knowledge of misconduct in science. I would do everything imaginable not to have to relay it to any specific source. From what I've experienced, it's better to run than fight. It's just a no-win situation. You can't, at least if you keep quiet, it might really go away, and you can slip away and keep doing your science and pretend it never happened. And unfortunately, and this is embarrassing to say, but that's just the best you can hope for if you are going to blow the whistle on somebody.
Bob Sprague never felt he had that option. He believed he had evidence Stephen Bruning had placed an extremely vulnerable population at risk. There was no way he could keep that to himself.
Well, I was obligated ethically, and legally, and morally to write to the National Institute of Mental Health about this, and I did in December of 1983. And I was incredibly naive. I thought all I had to do was report it, and the government or the bureaucracy would take care of it, and how wrong I was. Nothing happened. Although I was contacted by them, and then about 6-7 months later, I was contacted. They were appointing an investigator, like a detective, Mr. James Shriver. And then about a year after that, I was just flabbergasted that they were investigating me. First, me, because I turned this in. I couldn't believe this.
Notwithstanding evidence that included a partial confession, the investigation of Stephen Bruning dragged on for over 3.5 years.
Well, as you can tell, still shocked by all this, and extraordinarily unhappy that there's this kind of reprehensible sluggishness on the part of the federal bureaucracy when it deals with very vulnerable people getting medication harmful. They can't take 3.5 years. It's just incredible.
In the end, the National Institute of Mental Health found Stephen Bruning guilty of knowingly, willfully, and repeatedly engaging in scientific misconduct. The case was referred to the Department of Justice. In the meantime, NIMH imposed on Bruning the severest penalty it could: no grants for 10 years. And what of Bob Sprague? Well, 1 month before the verdict on Bruning was made public, Sprague learned funding for his research would also be cut. After 16 years of continuous support, NIMH was shutting him down. The agency claims the timing is completely coincidental.
What I suppose distresses me about the scientific community's reaction to whistleblowers is that the emotional reaction to defending the herd against somebody who is perceived upon as attacking them, namely the whistleblowers, seems to be at a deeper, more permanent and less thinking and more automatic level than any emotional reaction to or any emotional commitment to truth, honesty in science. In general, I'm talking about. And I find that startling and distressing, and particularly distressing because perhaps when the chips are down, that's how I will behave.
My wife was diabetic for 28 years, and in 1984 she had kidney failure, and she lived another 1.5 years. And most of her adult life was absolutely dependent on medication. She couldn't live without it. And particularly the last 2 years of her life, not hourly, almost certainly every day was dependent upon medication. Had somebody cheated, and I'm certainly not saying that they did, on her medication, caused her suffering, I would have been livid, furious. And I don't think I'm different from any other family in the United States. Particularly if it's a child, it's even worse. People expect, if there's a sacred trust in our society, it's got to be that medical research is honest and truthful and done properly. That's the way I feel. Everybody has that right. And for me, I don't care if it is a gigantic National Institute of Mental Health. I don't care if they crush me. I have got to continue this. I know how she suffered. I know how she felt about medication. I know how I felt about it. And I am certainly no different from any parent that has a child that's mentally retarded. We cannot have cheating and fraud in medical research. We can't have National Institute of Mental Health taking 3.5 years when the evidence is clear-cut. And we can't have universities, because it's going to be embarrassing to them, to either not do anything or, in fact, make statements that are not completely factual.
We have to admit that the scientific community has had a problem dealing with fraud. The history of recent events shows that many cases of fraud have not been dealt with well, that the allegations have not been handled well by the institutions that have been dealing with them. Fraud is a rare event in science. Most science is very well done. It's honest. The vast majority of science is of this sort, and perhaps because fraud is unusual, we don't have any agreed mechanism for dealing with it. We need to have such a mechanism. We need to have guidelines for dealing with fraud. We need, in fact, to say as a community, we are absolutely committed to rooting out fraud, that if fraud occurs, we will deal with it expeditiously, we will deal with it efficiently, and if we find it, we will deal with the consequences. If we do not have such a set of guidelines, somebody else will impose them upon us.
And I don't want you to get the impression that this committee is going to stage a one-day hearing, bring you up, make you miserable, and then let you go on about your business. When we do these things, we try and see to it that the pain and suffering goes on for a greater period of time until the abuse that is obvious is taken care of. We're going to be visiting again about these matters, and I will tell you that I find that your enforcement mechanisms are hopelessly inadequate, and that rascality seems to be triumphing over virtue in many instances in a fashion that I find totally unacceptable. I hope you do too. In any event, Doctor, we thank you and your associates for being here. We have kept you over long, and we do look forward to our next visit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Skeletons have to come out of the closets. Bureaucrats' careers have to be impaired if that's what it takes. And there's no alternative to this. This is ethically required. I think this is legally required, and it's certainly morally required. Now, they may shut me up if I keep talking like this, particularly on camera, but I have no alternative. Somebody has to take a stand here.
Take a look at local issues facing voters on the November ballot. Tomorrow night at 8 on Campaign 88, the Illinois issues. The American Experience is next on 12.